Bingo.
Thank you, Cahirlock. The Paris Agreement on climate change last year was significant in that the world collectively recognised not only the fact that climate change exists, but that we all have a part to play in combating it. The conversation has moved on from whether the phenomenon is real or imagined, and we are not just talking about which studies are valid, and we no longer entertain sceptics. Language around this global problem has shifted to include terminology like climate justice, which acknowledges that climate change affects everyone, but not equally. Climate justice is a term indicating there are environmental, social, economic and political implications of climate change all around the world, impacting most on those who depend on their surrounding environment to meet their basic needs, like food and shelter, and those already living in poverty. Climate justice acknowledges there are people who are disproportionately affected by climate change and therefore should not disproportionately carry the burden and solutions to climate change. It also acknowledges that there are people who do not have access to basic resources which may protect them from the consequences of climate change, such as shelter, money, technological advances, or a political environment which vindicates their human rights. Both at home and abroad, climate change must be met with an equitable effort-sharing approach so that all countries and domestic stakeholders act according to their responsibility and capacity in line with international climate and sustainable development obligations. I would like to echo Trócaire's key recommendation to the Government, which I find particularly relevant to the situation facing rural communities by the inequity and burden sharing, mainly through Ireland's renewable energy policy. Trócaire states we must prioritise a just transition domestically and globally and establish adequate social and environmental safeguards to ensure policies do not result in unintended impacts on the rights and resilience of vulnerable communities. Wind farms have dominated the renewable energy conversation in Ireland and have disproportionately impacted on rural communities like those in Donegal due to the delicate balance of rural living and the surrounding environment. The dominance of wind farm production has led to the current government to ignore newer technologies and more sustainable approaches to renewable energy. Last year, I published a policy document on biomass, emphasising the potential this renewable energy form could have for rural Ireland, both economically and environmentally. Biomass could effectively target residential and small-scale industry carbon emission production while creating jobs, stimulating the local economy and reducing the environmental impact that wind farms have on rural communities. The Government is introducing a heat incentive for industry, and rightly so, but we must empower residents to help combat carbon emissions as part of equitable burden sharing. This means also introducing a domestic heat incentive to facilitate this. For rural communities, this is what equitable burden sharing means, and for that reason I have called for a moratorium on wind farming until all other forms of renewable energy are explored and sufficiently invested in. The Government joined the international community in signing the Paris Agreement and is now obliged to introduce policies and implement them over the next number of years to bring about climate action in this country. However, the EPA this year highlighted that Ireland is well off course for meeting even existing EU climate targets for 2020, let alone keeping global temperatures below 2 degrees. We are so far behind that ambition, and action will have to increase exponentially over the next few decades just to keep up with older obligations, never mind new ones. In December 2015, the Government launched its white paper on Ireland's transition to a low-carbon energy future. Its vision is for Ireland to be a country where greenhouse gas emissions from the energy sector will be reduced by 80 to 95% compared to 1990 levels, by 2050 falling to zero or below by 2100. Energy accounts for around 66% of carbon emissions in Ireland, and so industry and agriculture must have its fair share of burden sharing in our transition to a sustainable low-carbon economy. As part of industry's burden sharing and the Government's acknowledgement of fairness required in any climate change approach, I urge the new Government to take on board Trócaire's call for this Government to join the global fossil fuel divestment movement. By joining the movement, the Government can bring state investments in line with international climate action obligations, starting with divesting the Irish Strategic Investment Fund of current investments in the fossil fuel industry and mandating the fund with a 100% renewable energy investment mandate. Maynooth University has already become the first Irish university to put in place a fossil-free investment policy, and I think the Government could take inspiration from that. Ireland needs to ensure its fair share of the global effort to combat climate change in terms of protecting those vulnerable to its consequences. We must reflect climate justice in our international development priorities set out by the new Government and place emphasis on the eradication of global poverty and the hunger exacerbated by extreme weather and climate change. Ireland's carbon emissions are equal to that of 400 million of the world's poor people already. So where's the sense in saying we're only a small country? How can we possibly have an impact if we reduce our carbon emissions? We are having a greater impact than a dozen or more poor countries combined. Taking action on climate change is one of Trócar's 5 key policy areas the new Dáil must focus on, and I would urge the same and to acknowledge that both at home and abroad, climate change affects everyone, but not all equally, and equitable burden sharing must be echoed in Ireland's climate change policies.